On Thursday, October 3rd, 2024, at 10:37 in the morning, Mason Harlan was running soybeans outside Nevada, Iowa, when the temperature gauge on his 2010 case IH 7088 combine climbed out of the safe range. It had been holding at 196 degrees all morning. Then it went to 214, then 229, then 241. By the time Mason killed the engine, the display was blinking 246 degrees, and the cooling fan sounded like it was pulling air through a wet blanket. He stepped down from the cab, stood in soybean stubble with 43 acres cut and 312 still standing, and looked west at a line of dark clouds moving in from Story County. The forecast gave him one dry day, maybe 1.5. He called Heartland Case IH at 10:51. A service writer named Grant Keller picked up on the third ring. Mason told him the model, the hours, the temperature climb, the fan noise, and the cloud line. Grant pulled up the machine history and came back 7 minutes later with a clean answer. Mason, those symptoms point to a failed cooling pack. On a 7088, we recommend replacing the whole radiator and oil cooler assembly together. Parts are $16,420. Labor is 12.5 hours at $186 an hour. Mobile call is $520. You're looking at $19,270 before tax. Mason didn't answer right away. Then Grant added the part that mattered more. Our first field tech opening is next Friday morning. Next Friday meant 8 days. 8 days meant rain. Rain meant the last 312 acres could sit under wet skies, and the low ground turned soft enough to bury a header cart. Mason asked one question. "Did you send anybody out to look at it?" Grant said. "The service code and symptom profile are enough for the estimate." That was the sentence Mason remembered. Not the price, not the weight. The sentence, "The service code and symptom profile are enough." At 11:19, Mason called his neighbor Dan Kepler. Dan had been fixing combines since before Mason knew how to climb into one. He was 72. His hands always looked half-washed, and he could tell the difference between a real engine problem and a dirty air problem by the way the fan pitch changed. Mason read him the numbers. Dan listened without interrupting. Then he said, "When did you last swing the cooler stack open?" Mason looked at the combine. The outside screen was clean. He had blown that off twice that morning. "The screen is clean," Mason said. Dan said, "I didn't ask about the screen. I asked when you swung the stack open." Mason was quiet. "Last fall," he said finally. "After corn." Dan sighed once. "Then don't buy anything yet." The case IH 7088 had a cooler stack that could be opened for cleaning, but most farmers treated the front screen like it told the whole truth. If the screen was clear, they assumed the cooler behind it could breathe. Dan knew better. Soybean fuzz, corn chaff, road dust, mud dauber nests, cottonwood seed, and dry leaf crumbs could pack behind the visible screen. The outside would look clean, the fan would still spin, but air couldn't move through the fins fast enough to carry heat away. A dealer computer would call that a cooling pack failure. A mechanic who had spent 50 harvests in field dust would call it a panel that had not been opened. Dan told Mason, "Get the machine back to the north lane and let it cool. Don't run it hot. I'll come by after lunch." Then he paused. "Where's Nora?" Mason's daughter. Nora was 15. She was a sophomore at Nevada High School, small enough that grown men still underestimated her, and serious enough in the FFAAG mechanics shop that her teacher had stopped checking her torque specs twice. That spring she had rebuilt the hydraulic cylinder on Mason's old auger swing hopper because nobody else wanted to crawl under it. In August, she had taken apart a plugged chaff spreader motor on the workbench, cleaned the brushes, and put it back together before supper. She kept a blue 3-ring Ag Mechanics binder in the back seat of her truck, organized by machine system: fuel, air, cooling, hydraulic, electrical. Cooling systems were tab 4. Mason said, "She's at school." Dan said, "Good. Don't open it before she gets home." Mason frowned. "Dan, I've got weather coming." "I know. That's why you need somebody who still reads the checklist." At 1:08, Dan pulled into the field lane in a white 1997 Ford service truck with a cracked amber light bar and 3 decades of spare fittings behind the seat. The combine sat cool enough to touch. Dan walked once around the machine. He rubbed 2 fingers across the front rotary screen, looked at the light film of dust, and nodded. "Looks clean from the wrong side," he said. He had Mason start the engine for a short idle test. At 196 degrees, the fan sounded normal. At 217, the pitch went heavy. At 232, Dan held his hand near the side of the cooler housing and shook his head. At 244, Mason shut it down. Dan pointed at the stack. "Heat's not leaving. That doesn't mean the cooler failed. It means the air path is lying." Mason wanted to reach for the latch right then. Dan stopped him. "Nora needs to see it unopened." At 3:42 that afternoon, Nora Harlan came down the gravel lane in Mason's old tan Silverado, her mother in the passenger seat, because Nora still had a school permit. She stepped out wearing a faded navy FFA sweatshirt, jeans with oil on one knee, and brown boots she had outgrown, but refused to replace until winter. She carried the blue binder under one arm and a dented stainless water bottle in the other. Mason told her the numbers, the temperature climb, the dealer quote, the 8-day wait, the line about the service code being enough. Nora listened without blinking. Then she asked the same question Dan had asked. "When did you last swing the stack open?" Mason looked at his daughter. "Last fall." Nora opened her binder without saying anything. She flipped to tab 4, Cooling Systems, page 11, and put her finger on the first diagnostic line. "Verify airflow through the full cooler stack before replacing cooling components." She read it out loud, not to shame him, to make the machine answer in the right order. Then she pulled a 1/2-inch wrench, a cordless impact with the torque set low, safety glasses, an N95 mask, and a nylon fin comb from the service truck. Mason said, "You think it's plugged?" Nora said, "I think a clean screen can hide a dirty stack." She unlatched the outer screen first. Nothing dramatic. Then she released the cooler stack access panel. The hinge groaned once, and the hidden side of the machine opened like a door nobody had wanted to admit existed. For 3 seconds, nobody spoke. The lower left corner of the cooler matrix was packed almost solid with gray soybean fuzz and tan corn chaff. Across the middle fins ran a hard crust of field dust, baked flat by heat. In the upper right corner, wedged behind a bracket, was a mud dauber nest, as long as Nora's hand. The outside of the machine had looked clean. The inside looked like a shop vacuum bag had been stuffed into the lungs of a combine. Nora leaned closer with her flashlight. "There's your $19,000, she said. Dan smiled, but he did not laugh. Mason didn't either because he could still see the storm line west of the trees, and now the problem was no longer a mystery, it was work. Nora started at 4:06. She did not blast the fins wildly. That would fold aluminum and make a small problem expensive. She used a wooden paint stirrer to loosen the mud dauber nest first. It came out in 3 hard pieces and landed in a 5-gallon bucket with a dry clack. Then she set the shop compressor regulator at 78 psi, low enough not to damage fins, strong enough to move packed dust. Dan brought over a portable fan and set it behind her to push the cloud away from her face. Mason held a work light. Nora worked from the clean side back through the dirty side, then from top to bottom, then diagonally across the packed lower corner. Slow passes. Not angry passes, the kind of passes taught by someone who knows that machinery does not reward panic. At 4:49, the first sheet of gray dust broke loose and rolled out of the stack like smoke. At 5:26, the bottom third began showing silver. At 6:11, Nora stopped, cleaned her safety glasses, took 2 drinks of water, and checked page 11 again. Mason noticed that he noticed she did not trust her memory. At 6:38, the mud crust in the center broke apart. At 7:21, the upper right corner finally cleared. At 7:46, Nora used the fin comb to straighten 6 bent rows where somebody, probably Mason, had gotten careless the year before. At 8:03, she made one last pass with air through the rear inspection gap. A clean stream came through. No dead pockets, no hidden mat, no fan labor. She closed the panel at 8:11 and torqued the 4 latch bolts to spec. Then Mason climbed into the cab. He started the engine at 8:16. The fan pulled air differently. That was the first proof. The pitch was lighter, cleaner, almost ordinary. The second proof came 14 minutes later, when the display still held at 196 degrees under idle. At 8:37, Mason eased into the soybeans with the work lights on. The temperature climbed to 211 under load. Then it held 10 minutes, 20:40. Nora stood in the lane with Dan and watched the red combine move across the field like nothing had ever been wrong with it. But with the order of belief, the dealership had believed the code before the machine. Mason had believed the clean screen before the hidden stack. Nora had believed the checklist. By 1:18 in the morning, Mason had cut the west half. By sunrise, he had 176 acres down. The rain held off until late Friday night, just long enough for him to finish the low ground that would have been a mess by Monday. The combine never climbed past 214 degrees again. Total cost of the repair was $21. $9 in compressor fuel, $12 for a new box of dust masks after Nora used the last one. No parts, no cooling pack, no 8-day wait. On Monday morning, word got around. It went first to the co-op scale house, then to the parts counter, then to the diner where retired farmers drink coffee like they are still supervising weather. By 9:30, half the county had heard some version of it. A 15-year-old girl saved harvest with a shop air hose. That was the simple version. It was also the laziest version. Nora did not save harvest because she was young. She did not save harvest because the story needed somebody surprising. She saved it because she asked the first question in the right order. When was the stack last opened? That question turned a $19,000 replacement into a $21 cleaning. That question turned 8 days of waiting into 4 hours of work. That question turned a dealer estimate into a 5-gallon bucket full of dust, chaff, and broken mud dauber nest. Dan drove to Heartland Case IH later that week, not to start a fight, but because he had bought parts there for 40 years and did not like watching a service desk forget how machines fail in real fields. Grant Keller was at the counter. So was the service manager, a broad-shouldered man named Owen Frick. Dan set Nora's phone photo on the counter. The picture showed the open cooling stack before cleaning, packed lower corner, dust crust, nest in the upper bracket, bright orange case, IA paint around it. No guessing needed. Owen looked at the photo for a long time. Dan said, "Your writer quoted a full cooling pack without asking whether the stack had been opened." Grant's face tightened. Owen did not defend him. He asked, "What did it run after cleaning?" 2. 11 under beans, Dan said. "Held all night." Owen looked at the photo again. Then he said the sentence that reached Mason by supper. "From now on, no cooling pack, quote, on a field machine, until the writer asks the panel question." That did not make the first estimate right. It did not make the price harmless, but it meant the next farmer might hear the question before the quote. On Tuesday afternoon, Mason wrote a check for $1,900 to the Nevada FAAG Mechanics Program. Not because Nora charged him. She refused. He wrote it because the binder in her truck had just done what a dealership computer had failed to do. The money bought a new torque wrench set, a digital multimeter, a set of fin combs, 3 respirator kits, and a laminated cooling system diagnostic chart for the shop wall. Nora's teacher hung the chart above the workbench, where freshmen could see it before they learned how to make expensive guesses. That winter, when the first-year students opened the cooling systems unit, page 1 was not about radiators, it was about airflow. By then, Mason had told the story enough times that he had stopped making himself sound smarter in it. He told the truth. The dealer had read the code and thought that was enough. The machine had been telling the truth from the beginning. They just had to open the right panel. Months later, Dan said the best part was not that Nora proved the dealer wrong. That was the part people liked to repeat, because it felt good. The best part was quieter. It was a 15-year-old girl standing in soybean stubble under a darkening Iowa sky, reading page 11 before touching a wrench. It was the old mechanic letting her do the work instead of taking the tool from her hand. It was a father learning that a clean surface can hide a blocked system, and it was a combine that almost got $19,000 spent on it, when what it really needed was for somebody to ask where the air stopped moving. Some people hear a fan straining and see a failed part. Some people see a blinking temperature, and once in a while, somebody with a blue FFA binder opens the panel nobody asked about, pulls out a nest that never belonged there, and gives the machine back its breath.